It's now 3 years since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And the map of the battlefield, one we've become so used to seeing as months of war have turned to years, has shifted and stagnated in that time. Michael Clarke is our defence and security analyst. This is the picture of war over the years.
Yes, if we think of it in time-lapse terms, we can see that where we are now is that the Ukrainians have got a little piece of Kursk, the Russians have got this piece of land in the southeast and the south, about 18% of Ukrainian territory in total. And they've grabbed little bits of it, but very, very slowly.
And it's changed because it was moving quickly to start with, but it has really slowed down.
And it's really slowed down since last November. The Russians are still moving forward, but they're losing 1,500 men a day on average and making tiny, tiny gains in territorial terms. But they are gaining. The Ukrainians are losing slowly, but they're losing, as it were, even more slowly than they were 6 months ago.
Because that sort of pace is really important. We talk about different theatres of war. We'll go into 3 today, and we'll talk about the front line, a bit of what we've been talking about now, but also the Black Sea and drone warfare. Just to the front line, you know, this is something that Sky's data and forensics team looks at, all the videos that are coming out, open source intelligence. And when it comes to that front line, especially, you know, Bakhmut we talked a lot about before it fell, but Toretsk is... Yeah, everyone was very worried that this is going to be next on the list, a lot more important than Bakhmut. If you look at the videos that are coming out of it, here's one. This is published by Ukraine. You can see there's a Ukrainian flag. Fine, this whole town is a complete wasteland, but the Ukrainian flags, different flags still flying. They're still in this battle in an important place.
They are, yeah. I mean, Bakhmut actually wasn't strategically so important, although there's a big struggle over it. Toretsk is important. And the Russians keep saying they've taken it, but they haven't. They've taken most of it, but the Ukrainians are holding on in the north, in the coal mines to the north and further to the west of it. And they're really making the Russians fight for it, not because they think they can hold on to it ultimately, but because they want to be expensive.
Yeah,
they want the Russians to lose lots of troops taking it. And they're doing the same in Cheshire and Pokrovsk, in this same sort of area. They're making the Russians pay dearly for every square metre of territory that they take.
It's a slightly different arena, a different theatre, where actually they've had great success and they're inflicting heavy damage, is the Black Sea, which we were talking about. And that's been, you know, a really sort of surprise win, if that's fair to say, for Ukraine.
Yeah. I mean, the Ukrainians are as it were, winning in the Black Sea competition, because what they've done is that they've effectively expelled the Black Sea fleet, very powerful Russian fleet, from Sevastopol, its base. The fleet's gone back to Novorossiysk in Russia itself. The Russians cannot now operate in the western part of the Black Sea, and that means that the Ukrainians can get their exports out.
So from Izmail, from Odessa, they can get
all the Odessa ports can now get their grain out to the Bosphorus and into the Mediterranean. They've even opened up Izmail, which gives them access to the Danube, and so they can use their riverine systems to get stuff into Western Europe.
They've done all that without a navy as well.
And they don't have a navy. They've done it with all sorts of clever means, and they've won this battle of the Black Sea for the time being. So this is a strategic gain. We don't talk about it very much because everyone's fixated on what's happening on the land. But the Ukrainians know that this is keeping them alive because it's keeping their trade with the outside world alive.
And it's just quietly going along. The other arena, the other theatre is in the skies. We want to talk about drone warfare again. This is something the data and forensics team look at. Now, this shows the average number, the daily number of long-range drones launched by Russia, according to Ukraine. You can see, you know, down from 11 in June. It's just been this really, really big increase. February, the largest yet. This has been, you know, really contested space, a really deadly and fatal space too.
Yeah, and the point about this, Tom, is that this is only an index of something else. Because the drones aren't the main threat. In a way, the drones are there to act as distractions, as decoys, to open up holes in Ukraine's air defence.
They tie up air defences.
Through which ballistic missiles and glide bombs come through. And so the increase in drone attacks is a symbol of the fact that they've increased attacks in all forms of aerial warfare. For 3 winters in a row, they've tried now to actually bring Ukraine to a halt, to attack the energy grid, to attack the infrastructure, to attack civilian targets. This winter's been the worst of all, but still the Ukrainians have so far withstood it. So in a way, strategically, this front, I'd say, has been a draw.
Yeah, and it is a full-on blitz now. And that, as you say, as that index is increasing, it's also a measure of another thing, which is the help that Russia has been getting that it's having to rely on, because those long-range missiles, those ballistic missiles, those bombs aren't just Russian, are they?
No, I mean, they're getting ballistic missiles from North Korea and drones. They're getting drones from Iran and maybe some ballistic missiles, and a great deal of help in components for these sorts of weapons from China. The Russians couldn't have done this on their own. They can only do it with the help of other governments which are feeding their military machine.
Because we talk about, the West keeping Ukraine in the fight, but the same applies on the other side.
Oh, the Russians need their friends to stay in the fight as well.
And so we see that, and as you say, it's contested. I think the next question becomes, how long can Russia sustain it? Again, we always talk about how long Ukraine can sustain it, but let's look at the Russian economy. Interest rates at 21%, inflation in January at 9.9% officially.
Yeah, that's the official figure. Nobody believes it. I mean, economists reckon that real inflation is well over 20%. I mean, if inflation wasn't 20%, interest rates wouldn't be 21%. The Russian economy, it's not going to collapse like a house of cards, as some people say, because it is built on state-created credit at the moment. But it is under strain. It is creaking. 40% of all government spending is going on defence, and more will go on it next year. They're cutting down on welfare payments. The market is shrinking. Investment is not very good. So if the Russians had to keep going like this for another 12 months, they would be in some economic trouble. They can keep going because it's a dictatorship. And if people are unhappy about it, there's not much they can do about it.
Well, and that is the question, is what happens next in this conflict? The political landscape is changing a lot, especially in terms of what other nations might offer, especially troops on the ground. So we'll go through some of those plans in a potential peace scenario. Basically calls for around 110,000 troops there as what's called a reassurance force. That's what the troops are needed in Ukraine. Is that feasible?
Well, this is the figure that President Zelensky said would be required to man a ceasefire line, because this would be the longest ceasefire line in history, the longest peacekeeping line in history, bar none. I mean, Ukraine's a very big country. And he said you need 110,000 troops. In fact, you would need 3 times that number, because for every group of troops you have on the line, you have another group waiting to go in training, and a group that's just come out that needs to rest and re-roll for something else. So you would have to tie up, whoever provides this 110,000 troops would have to tie up 330,000 troops. And if it was successful, you're talking about having them there for 20 or 30 years.
It's a generational thing.
Generational.
And then, so if some of those troops are European, 30,000 troops, perhaps, in that actually means what you need, as you're saying, 3 times that 90,000 from Europe. You think what it means for the UK, if, say, the UK is providing, what, I don't know.
Well, if we put in 10,000, that would mean that we'd have to have 30,000 troops, which actually would not be available for anything else.
Pretty much half the British Army.
Yeah, the British Army is 70,000 now, so 30,000 of the 70,000, in effect, will be lost to any other military purpose other than this
for 20
a couple
to 30
of generations.
years. Yeah.
I mean, show me the peacekeeping operation that came to an end after 2 years or 3 years. It doesn't exist.
The plan would be not necessarily to have these at the front line. We'll talk about a different scenario, but it'd be to look after key infrastructure throughout Ukraine. So not on the front line because people are worried about what that would mean, clashes with Russian troops, but looking at things, throughout Ukraine, nuclear sites, airports, seaports, things like that, and keeping those safe.
This will be a different conception to say, look, we're not trying to put troops on the peacekeeping line. We're trying to maybe offer troops to Ukraine to look after certain critical facilities, to make sure it can continue to function. Because what the Americans say, what Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, says, what Mr. Trump says, is that they want Ukraine to be a sovereign, independent, secure country at the end of all of this. And if so, then certain things have got to be protected, and maybe the Ukrainians could do with some help. That's a possibility. But the Russians have said, we don't want any European troops, certainly not NATO troops as NATO, but even European troops on a bilateral basis. We don't want any of them in Ukraine. And I think they mean that. I mean, they will not stand for it for all sorts of reasons. So this idea is a bit theoretical at the moment.
A lot of it is quite theoretical. I mean, I suppose what wouldn't be, if we talk about a demilitarised zone, DMZ, or as Americans would call it, a DMZ, as you say, look, this is here in green. That's what it would be. It is really, really long. We think of, if you think of other DMZs like the one between North and South Korea, which has endured since the end of the Korean War for, decades and decades. This is a very, very different beast, and it might need different approaches.
Yeah, I think we forget about this being patrolled in some significant way. There are other ideas around. I mean, one would be to say, why don't we just let the Ukrainians do it? The Ukrainians themselves say, if we had the resources, we'd do it ourselves. We'd look after our own frontier. So one idea is give them the $210 billion, which are frozen Russian assets in Europe, There's 300 odd in the world, but 210 billion of them, roughly, sit in Europe. Give them those assets, let them buy whatever they want, and then they can do it themselves. That's one idea. Another idea, interestingly, is to say, just declare it to be the frontier. No peacekeeping troops, no reassurance troops. That is the frontier. With this interesting rider, that's our new interim frontier. If the Russians take one step over it, we will give Ukraine instant and unconditional membership of NATO. Now, that idea is simple, elegant, and very, very scary to all of the leaders in the Western world, not least in Washington.
And that is, where so much this is so important. As you say, it's been a stagnant front line in terms of on the ground, but everything else is shifting and seems to shift with every summit, with every post on X. It really is all in the balance. Michael Clarke, thank you very much for that analysis. It's a crucial few weeks, months into the spring for Ukraine.